They stabbed, shot, poisoned, and drowned him, but something in Rasputin refused to rot. A holy man to the dying empire, a devil to his killers, and a corpse that would not behave. Grigori Rasputin, the self-proclaimed holy man and mystic from Siberia, rose to power as the spiritual confidant of Empress Alexandra in the crumbling final years of Imperial Russia. Accused of manipulating the Romanovs and corrupting the court, he became a lightning rod for national hatred. His murder in 1916, orchestrated by nobles and carried out in grotesque ritualistic stages, was not merely an execution, it was an exorcism. But the more they tried to kill him, the more monstrous he became. The village of Pokrovskoy, where Grigori Rasputin was born in 1869, was less a settlement than a wound stitched together with frost and dung. The wind there never stopped moving, it carried the stink of manure and unwashed flesh across splintered fences and into the mouths of children who learned early not to ask questions. Rasputin grew up in that stench, barefoot in snowmelt, his toes blue and split, his fingernails already blackened by soil and rot by the age of 7. His eyes were wrong even then, wide, pale, too still, like something was looking through him rather than out of him. The elders said he'd been touched by God. The livestock began to avoid him. At 10, he suffered seizures that left him sobbing and screaming the names of saints no one had taught him. His father beat the demons out of him with a birch rod soaked in vinegar and urine. But the visions stayed. They worsened. He spoke of fire beneath the snow, of wolves with human faces, of bleeding sons and a man nailed to wood with his mouth sewn shut. His mother died in silence. His siblings followed. Rasputin lived. By 23, the visions had become a compass. He left the village barefoot, walking north and west through forests swollen with thaw, sleeping in abandoned sheds and cow stalls, feeding on moldy crusts and puddle water, his beard clumped with vomit and sap. Pilgrimage, he called it. Monasteries turned him away for his odor. One abbey reported that the smell of his feet made the novices sick. Yet in some places, he was received, not with reverence, but with unease. He would kneel and convulse before icons, weeping uncontrollably, then mutter to the walls, repeating phrases in a low drone until someone made him leave. He never stopped praying. Not even in sleep. Over time, the rot seemed to become part of him. His hair, matted and greasy, hung to his chest in clumps, lice nested in his robes. His teeth yellow to the color of old candles, and his skin, stretched tight over bone, was forever slick with sweat. But his hands, massive, warm, damp, trembled with something the sick and hopeless mistook for holiness. He touched women on the forehead, and they fell into spasms. He kissed the feet of children and told them their bones would not break. He could smell weakness. He called it divine scent. By the time Rasputin reached St. Petersburg in 1905, he looked less like a prophet and more like a cadaver dragged from a ditch. His eyes, ringed and purple, did not blink for minutes at a time. His speech was broken, slurred, often nonsense, yet when he spoke to the Tsarina, she wept. He called her little mother. He called her son blessed bleeder. She called him friend. When he touched the boy's forehead, the hemorrhages slowed. When he prayed, the fever dropped. No doctor could match it. But the doctors were not blind. Nor were the maids. The nobility recoiled behind closed fans. Servants whispered that his skin was peeling. That they'd seen lesions beneath his sleeves. That he stank of blood and milk and sulfur. Some claimed his shadow didn't follow the light correctly. Others swore they saw flies gather on his lips while he smiled. They crossed themselves when he passed. Rasputin knew. And he enjoyed it. He called it fear of the true cross. In salons, he mocked the clergy, drank until his vomit stained the marble floor, then sang hymns through clenched teeth. He whispered to duchesses about pain as salvation and kissed their palms until they trembled. They called him disgusting. They called him divine. They could not look away. But a sickness can be worshipped only so long before it is purged. And in Rasputin's case, the body that would expel him was not the church or the state, it was the very nobility that had fed on him. They would come to see him not as a healer but as a tumor. One that bled. One that would not die easily. And the empire, already bleeding from its seams, would take one last breath before trying to cut him out. That was the beginning. And beginnings always rot from the feet. The wind that night gnawed through St. Petersburg like a starving dog, stripping bark from trees and biting at stone. Snow, thick and wet, clung to the eaves of the Yusupov palace like mold. The Neva groaned under ice. Inside, the rooms glowed with candlelight, but the warmth was hollow, perfumed to mask something sharper, fear. In the basement, silver trays glittered. A gramophone whined out a lullaby, scratched and wavering. And the pastries steamed gently with death. Rasputin arrived late. His boots, crusted with frozen manure, left black slush in the entryway. The fur of his coat, once wolf, now mangy, hung heavy with snowmelt, dripping onto polished parquet in erratic patterns like inkblots. His eyes were narrowed, sunk deeper into their sockets than they had been a month ago, and his beard twitched with each breath as if something lived inside it. The air shifted when he entered, not because of his presence, but because of his smell. Sour milk, old sweat, something iron-sweet and faintly fungal. One servant gagged silently into his sleeve. Yusupov greeted him with forced cheer, voice cracking on every syllable. Rasputin said little. His gaze moved around the room as if searching for a hole in the floor that would take him elsewhere. He was led down into the basement parlor, lavish in its attempt to deceive, where cake and wine waited under candelabra light. The walls were lined with fox pelts and Orthodox icons, mouths open in frozen snarls, eyes turned down in judgment. The air smelled of almond. Cyanide. They told him the women would come soon. They told him the Tsarina had sent word. They told him anything to keep him seated. He said nothing, only reached out with cracked fingers and plucked a slice of cake from the plate. His fingernails were rimmed in black. The cake was soft, honeyed, faintly warm. He chewed slowly. A flake of dried blood came loose from his lower lip as he swallowed. Nothing happened. Yusupov offered wine, voice trembling under the weight of expectation. Rasputin drank. Half the glass in a single movement, throat working visibly. The poison moved through his gut like frost up a pane of glass, silent, inevitable, meant to burn him from the inside out. They waited. He shifted in his seat. A cough. A long exhale. A bead of sweat. Then nothing. 10 minutes. Then 20. The warmth in the room thickened into a kind of panic. The gramophone needle hit the center and clicked endlessly. Rasputin reached for another pastry. Yusupov stepped back. A murmur passed between the men upstairs. Someone was sent down to check, a footman who returned pale and silent. Rasputin had begun humming. The same 3 notes, over and over, like a lullaby he'd learned in a fever dream. 30 minutes. He slumped slightly. His head hung for a moment, and one man gripped the edge of the table, ready to rise. But Rasputin straightened. His pupils were huge now, 2 pits of oil in a dead man's face. His tongue flicked against his cracked lip. He blinked once. Slowly. Then smiled. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. I feel warm, he said finally, voice low and wet. The Lord is here tonight. Yusupov stepped forward, one hand behind his back, knuckles widening around a pistol grip. Another man whispered, he is not human. Rasputin's head turned sharply, neck cracking audibly. His grin widened, exposing a tooth gone gray at the root. I see you, he muttered. All of you. Every sin. The candle nearest to him flickered, sputtered, died. And the feast became an altar. The silence that followed Rasputin's smile was colder than the wind clawing at the windows above. The poisoned cake sat untouched now, sagging on their tray like corpses in pastry shrouds. Yusupov stood pale and rigid near the doorway, the pistol trembling in his gloved hand, a revolver polished for ceremony, not for blood. His breath caught in his throat, stuck somewhere between prayer and vomit. Rasputin's head tilted slightly, as if hearing something behind the walls. His eyes, those twin ulcers of oil, fixed on nothing, then on Yusupov, then on the flickering icon above the fireplace, where the Virgin stared down with a look of wooden pity. He rose slowly. The creak of his chair legs was louder than it should have been, dragged across the floor like the sound of a coffin lid being shut. Yusupov fired. The shot cracked through the chamber like a whip splitting flesh. The bullet entered just left of the breastbone, near the heart, where, by any human logic, it should have ended the story. Bone shattered with a sound like breaking teeth. Rasputin staggered, his mouth opening in a breathless gasp, as if surprised by something deeper than pain. A bloom of red spread across his shirt, flowering through wool and linen, the heat of it steaming faintly in the cold air. He fell backwards, arms limp, legs folding under him like wet branches. The smell of cordite fused with blood, metallic, hot, and animal. His beard twitched once. Then stillness. Yusupov backed away. The pistol dropped to his side. Another man crossed himself. Someone sobbed softly. Then, a twitch. It began with the fingers, a small spasm, a flexing of blood-slicked knuckles. Then the jaw, clenching and unclenching, teeth grinding. A moan followed, low, guttural, rising from deep inside the chest as if pulled from a furnace of rot. One eye opened. Yusupov screamed. Rasputin lurched upward with a sound like torn cloth, blood cascading from his wound in thick ropes. He moved not like a man but like something animated by spite, ribs broken, chest caved, yet still clawing at life with fingernails darkened by filth. The scream that followed was not his but Yusupov's, echoed by others upstairs. Boots thundered above. Servants fled. The monk stumbled toward the staircase, clutching his side, blood leaving a heavy trail behind him, bright, almost black, against the white fur of the carpet. Each step was a grunt of agony, his breath now a rattle, bubbles forming at the corner of his lips. The second shot came from behind, a sharp crack, then a wet punch of exit as the bullet tore through flesh and spine, bursting out near the stomach in a fan of red and brown. He collapsed to all fours. And still, crawled. Hands slick, knees buckling, teeth gritted like a beast gnawing through wire. Blood soaked through his robes, spilling in strings down the stairs, smearing the marble floor like sacrament. The breath came in wet snarls now, thick with fluid. His skin had turned an ashen gray-blue, the pallor of a man moments from death, and yet his fingers kept clawing forward, dragging his body toward the tall double doors yawning open at the end of the hall. Snow had begun to fall again, slow and silent. The cold slapped his face as he stumbled into the courtyard, eyes wild, mouth open in a cracked wheeze. The frost licked at his wounds like knives, and steam rose from his chest where blood met air. He reached for the gate. A final shot rang out, one last thunderclap of panic, aimed at a man who would not stop. His body jerked, collapsed against the frozen ground. The snow around him turned black. The courtyard reeked of gun smoke, blood, and steaming urine. Rasputin's body lay twisted on the frozen stone, his limbs splayed at odd angles, his face turned skyward, slack-jawed, crusted with spittle, and lit faintly by the gaslight that flickered above the gate. For a moment, the killers only stood there, panting, watching. Waiting. Snow fell onto his chest in soft flakes, melting into the heat still leaking from the bullet wounds. But then a sound, not from the throat, but from somewhere deeper. A rasping breath, wet and sharp, like lungs torn open trying to pull in the last of a dying world. Yusupov shrieked and staggered back. Another man raised the pistol again and fired point-blank into Rasputin's forehead. This time, the body jerked, then stilled. They moved quickly after that. Two of them wrapped the monk's limbs in torn lengths of curtain cord, crossing the arms over his chest and knotting the rope tight enough to leave bruises even on a corpse. The fabric stuck to his skin where blood had begun to clot and freeze, and the smell of wet wool and entrails made one of the men retch violently into the snow. Someone fetched iron rods from the basement, fireplace pokers, heavy with soot and rust, and used them to strike the ribs, hips, face. Not with anger, but with fear. Each blow landed with a thick, damp crack. Teeth came loose. One eye began to swell shut. Blood spilled again, but sluggishly now, darker, sluggish, more syrup than fluid. When they were certain he would not rise again, they dragged him toward the river. The Neva loomed at the edge of the city like a waiting grave. The water was black under the ice, a slow-moving organ beneath a skin of glass. They found a weak patch near the embankment and hacked at it with boots and iron until it split like an eyelid torn open. The air stank of rot, fish, and the long dead. Rasputin's body, bound and soaked, was heaved up and tipped headfirst into the hole. His skull struck the edge of the ice with a dull crack. Then silence. The surface closed behind him, slow and smooth, as if it had never been disturbed. They walked away. 3 days later, the body was found downstream, trapped beneath a wooden support beam, snagged by the folds of his coat. It took 4 men to lift him. The skin had swollen and turned the color of candle wax, stretched tight over cheeks and fingers. Blisters pocketed the legs. The belly was distended, lumpy with gas and slow decay. His beard, still matted with blood, hung like seaweed. Yet his hands, once bound, were now loose. Fingers clawed upward, nails torn and packed with ice. In the autopsy room, the smell was unbearable. The head doctor wore a cloth soaked in vinegar over his face, but still gagged when they opened the mouth and water spilled out, not pooled in the throat, but deep in the lungs. The body had breathed beneath the ice. One attendant fainted when the eyes were pried open, and found to be already ajar. Glassy, unfocused, yet not vacant. A film of frost covered the corneas, but beneath it lingered something sharp, not life, but awareness. As if the last image they captured was the blur of moving water, and the last thought was rage. A priest summoned to bless the remains refused to enter the room. Another, more obedient, whispered a rushed prayer from the threshold but would not meet the gaze of the dead. He said it was like blessing a curse. The pathologist who stitched the corpse closed whispered later to a nurse, hands shaking so badly he could not tie the last thread. "We didn't kill him. We just handed him over." When she asked to whom, he only looked toward the door, and crossed himself. There was no thunder the morning they buried him, only fog, thick as milk, clinging to the earth like something trying to smother it. The air above Tsarskoye Selo tasted of iron and old incense, and the breath of soldiers steamed gray against the silence, their boots sinking into the half-thawed mud that lined the procession path. The coffin was sealed tight, not out of reverence, but necessity. Even in death, Rasputin stank. Rot had begun in the soft places, groin, lips, under the arms, and traveled upward. His skin, they said, had turned the color of wet parchment, and the last bullet hole, the one between the eyes, had reopened during transport, seeping black through the casket with like a second, weeping mouth. The Empress did not attend. She remained upstairs, locked in a small icon room, where the scent of beeswax and myrrh could not drown out the smell of despair. They said she had not spoken a full sentence since the body was pulled from the river. Her eyes were swollen shut with prayer. Her fingers bled from tracing the crucifix until the gold left green smudges on her skin. One maid reported she screamed at night, not with grief, but with pleading. "Bring him back," she begged. Not to life, to justice. He was a martyr. Nicholas, the Tsar, wept behind curtains. A monarch rendered hollow by years of war and whispers, he clutched his son's discarded toys with the same desperation the boy had clutched his bleeding joints. He signed papers with shaking hands, his signature now a faint scratch instead of a command. Ministers came and went, but no one stayed long in the palace. The air had changed. Dust settled faster. Doors creaked louder. Food spoiled quicker. Some said the mirrors grew cloudy at night, as if breath from unseen mouths fogged them. But the body would not rest. Weeks later, revolutionaries stormed the burial site, a quiet plot behind the imperial stables, and tore the coffin from the earth with shovels and curses. They smashed the wood apart. Inside, the corpse had swollen grotesquely, the skin split in places, revealing ribs like blackened fence posts beneath white fat. A soldier vomited. Another crossed himself before striking a match. They burned him in an open field. The fire, stoked with vodka and torn pages of Orthodox scripture, burned for hours, but the body took longer than expected to catch. Grease bubbled beneath the skin. The head blackened. One leg twitched in the flames. And as the skull collapsed inward, one of the men swore he heard a voice, not a scream, but a laugh. Another, years later, would wake from fevered dreams hearing the same sound and claw at his ears until he bled. His ashes scattered into the wind. But the rot had already taken hold. In the Winter Palace, servants refused to enter certain halls after dusk. They whispered of damp footprints in empty corridors, of icons that wept wax, of doors that opened toward walls. The Empress was said to talk to shadows, calling them friend. The boy, the fragile heir, stopped smiling. Court physicians found no illness. Just dread. And then came the prophecy. Rasputin, in his last weeks, had written it crudely in his notebook, a misshapen hand scrawling through wine stains and drops of dried blood. "If I am killed by common men, Russia may yet heal." But if I die at the hands of nobles, not one of them will remain alive within 2 years. The blood of Romanovs will run in cellars. He died in December of 1916. In July of 1918, the entire imperial family was gunned down in a basement in Ekaterinburg, their bodies burned, teeth pried from skulls, daughters stabbed where bullets had bounced off corsets sewn with diamonds. Rasputin's curse had ripened. Not as vengeance, but as infection. His death had not cleansed the empire. It had opened the wound. And Russia, bled from within, would spend the next century trying to cauterize the phantom limb of a man it could not kill. In the months that followed Rasputin's murder, Russia, already trembling beneath the weight of war, starvation, and unrest, began to buckle in earnest. The Tsar's authority, once unquestionable, now looked brittle and absurd. Confidence in the monarchy drained like old blood, and the streets of Petrograd swelled with hunger and rage. Soldiers deserted their posts. Factories fell silent. Breadlines turned into riots. Rasputin's death, meant to save the dynasty, had instead pulled the last thread from an unraveling empire. By the spring of 1917, Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. The Romanov crown passed into myth. And scarcely 18 months after Rasputin's bloated corpse was dragged from the Neva, the entire imperial family was taken into a basement, lined against a wall, and reduced to meat and bone by bullets and bayonets. What was supposed to be a purging act, a noble execution in the name of salvation, came to be remembered as a final, desperate failure. Not an exorcism, but a catalyst. The assassination that would cleanse Russia of its evil counselor, instead marked the moment the state collapsed from within. Those who had plotted Rasputin's demise saw their world consumed. Some fled. Others died. And those who remained lived long enough to understand that they had not killed a man, they had lit the fuse of something vast, irreversible, and soaked in consequence. In the decades that followed, Rasputin did not fade. He multiplied. His name passed between lips in hushed awe and revulsion, in barracks, in brothels, in classrooms where history was rewritten in red ink. His death grew more grotesque with each telling: 9 bullets, 12, drowned, flayed, buried alive, eyes open in the fire, heart still beating beneath the ash. He became a rumor that stained every retelling of the Romanovs' fall. A specter of madness and prophecy. To some, he was a demon, an animal wrapped in rags, rightly butchered too late. To others, he was a holy fool, a martyr whose blood opened the gates of judgment. But to all, he remained one thing above all else. The monk who simply would not die.